We open up Jujutsu Kaisen chapter 258 where the last one left off. My goodness, to say that this one cooked was a bit of an understatement, because we now have seen how Sukuna is able to turn the tables after getting hammered with what seemed like 1 million black flashes in the last chapter, and it's because the whole time he had one of the most iconic phrases in anime in the community for the last 5 years up his sleeve: domain expansion. But that's not the only thing that Sukuna had up his sleeves either. However, before we get to that moment, there's quite a bit to go over. The narrator tells us that after so many black flashes, Yuji has managed to do major damage to Sukuna because his attacks were hitting the boundary between Sukuna and Megumi's souls, and it goes further in showing you how important Yuki was and still remains to the story long after her death, because had it not been for that book that she left behind that Yuji studied, we wouldn't be at this point, because that information is how Yuji managed to hit the barrier between the souls separating Fushiguro and Sukuna to try and jar him away from Sukuna. With the narrator dropping that line in there is further proof that something big is being cooked up later on down the line, but of course we'll have to go through the story a little bit further to find out what that is. But there are some short-term payoffs to what's happened here. Mainly, Sukuna's reverse curse technique has been affected by Yuji, and it's not just dampening his curse energy output as well. It's also the narrator showing us that while Yuji is climbing up the ranks of Jujutsu Kaisen in terms of the power scaling, he's also quickly becoming a bad matchup for Sukuna, the same way that Ramen hinted that might be the case if Yuji continues to grow, because we found out last chapter that Yuji, his father, was the reincarnated soul of Sukuna's brother. However, as we're about to see, there are levels to fighting Sukuna, and he's now up the ante by using his domain expansion. And interestingly enough, there's a moment where he's using finger signs similar to what Gojo used when he activated the domain expansion, but given Sukuna only has 2 right arms, it does make a lot of sense. And also, again, because of the binding vow that Sukuna made in order to be able to use the world-cutting slash when he fought against Gojo, it activated under certain conditions. It makes sense that we're at this point we're at now. That's also interesting because it just goes to show that Gojo, he was a very worthy opponent for Sukuna, because during all these different challengers that Sukuna's had show up, he's never used domain expansion. He's never even choreographed that he even thought about using it. Granted, to be fair, he didn't truly need it against people like Kashimo, but things right now, they aren't what they seem to be, because his domain expansion, while it's back, there is a catch to it. There are a few catches to it. So the narrator tells us that Sukuna, he altered the hand signs and used a part of the brain not affected by Gojo's infinite void, and then tells us that Sukuna has used, quote, a maelstrom of uncertainties and impromptu binding vows. Sukuna's black flashes allowed his Malevolent Shrine to burst forth once more with no losses in output or range, end quote, which is basically the narrator telling us that Sukuna, he's just him. Despite Sukuna having his back against the wall, he isn't out of options and is slowly becoming more dangerous. But the interesting thing here is that for an unknown reason, his Malevolent Shrine, it looks different than normal, which I do find fascinating, because this is us seeing that for as dangerous as Sukuna is, there's still some openings for Yuji to exploit. Normally, his Malevolent Shrine looks like an actual shrine, but this one almost looks like a beaten up cursed spirit. However, despite its appearance, this domain expansion is still super deadly when it goes off, and Itadori even ends up losing his leg, and after it does, Sukuna, he does major damage to the area, which then brings us to the very important context to the Sukuna battle that we have, and it's being given in the form of the flashback, and we learn quite a few things, like the confirmation that Yuji, he did eat the other curse wound paintings, but now we learn why Choso had him do it, among other things. So let's unpack everything we got during this 1 month time skip before the fight, because this was quite the info dump. The Jujutsu High students, they are all gathered around and they're discussing the upcoming battle with Sukuna, and there's a lot of emphasis placed on anti-domain measures and reverse curse technique, which makes sense given that their opponent was Sukuna, and they needed to be ready for the likely and highly probable outcome that Gojo would be cut in half fighting Sukuna, which, yep, that happened. And that's where we run into the first problem, which is that Yuji, he's out of luck in this regard because at this point in the timeline, he's at a point where he hasn't learned either of those techniques. And I love this flashback has shown us that information just to highlight for us how much Yuji's grown in a short period of time, because he hasn't been a jujutsu sorcerer for a long time. And even Yuji's growth, it gets explained to us because Kusakabe chalks it up to muscle memory due to Yuji's body being used for Sukuna, and Sukuna having used so many special grade curse level techniques. So Yuji basically got the experience points when Sukuna was controlling his body, if we were to use a video game analogy. Even though Yuji himself didn't rack up the experience points, he still got them and benefited from them because of what Sukuna did when he was in control. We also learn about reverse curse technique, and Shoko breaks everything down for us by saying the idea is to convert curse energy into blood, but then it gets tricky when trying to use on others because there are times where the body will reject someone else using reverse curse technique on them, with her saying that that's why there are times her reverse curse technique doesn't seem to work and it's a case-by-case basis when trying to use it on others. What this segment also does is it highlights for us just how much of a monster Yuta and Hikari are, because both of them are pretty bluntly saying that when it comes to using reverse curse technique, they're basically on autopilot. And we saw how Yuji a few chapters ago, he was busting his ass trying to use it with Choso there, keeping him calm and walking him through it. Which, speaking of Choso, we learned that Choso's body is special because his body pretty much does it for him when it comes to using curse energy and blood, which due to this, he doesn't have to use as much curse energy to heal himself as a normal person. And it's because of this and Yuji eating the cursed wounds that Yuji has the same gift, which also allows for Yuji to drastically cut down the amount of time needed to learn reverse curse technique in this way. On one hand, it is easy to say that, hey, Yuji, he gets a cheat code, but as we'll see, even then there's a shortcut and he still has to put in the work in order to get the skill level, and given the fact that he's had to use it for reverse curse technique and also for learning the simple domain technique, and then also learning how to use those soul punches. Yuji did put in some work. However, it is cheating like Okotsu and Yuji told to Sukuna, but we'll get to that later on. So this brings us to Oui Oui and what I find to be the most fascinating part of the chapter. The younger brother of Mei, who has been popping up in and around the battlefield, and we learn how his curse technique works, and it's pretty interesting. On the surface level, it's teleportation, but there's a lot more to it than that. So the guy, he can swap souls between vessels, basically. Gege uses a very easy to understand explanation, saying that up until now, most people, they thought of the soul and the body as two different things. And if you go back to Mahito and that whole discussion about the soul, that's paying off a lot of stuff. So if the body is in the box, then the soul is going to be the contents. He says, think of that box basically under the Christmas tree as it being someone's birthday present, Christmas present. But if he has permission of the gift owner, then the contents of the box, i.e. the body that's inside the box and the soul that's inside the body, it can be taken, which means he can swap the souls of two more people. And then Yuji, when he hears this, at first he's thinking very deep in thought, and for a moment I'm thinking he's having a meltdown like you normally see with idiot main characters like, say, Marshall, but he was comparing it to what he knew about Mahito and how his curse technique works, which, wow, I would have loved to have seen Oui Oui and Mahito interact with him knowing about how Oui Ui's curse technique works. So Oui Oui tells him, hey, don't even think about like Mahito, who was touching the soul and changing its shape, versus what he's doing is he's taking the soul and he's swapping it without having to touch the soul itself. But the implication is in the narration that it needs to be consensual. So say scenario one, that he's gonna go up to Sukuna and swap his soul into, say, a rat or an ant, and then they just step on the rat or the ant, and then we roll credits for Jujutsu Kaisen story. That doesn't apply there because it's not consensual. So if you're wondering why he hasn't used it against Sukuna, this is why. The whole purpose of Oui Oui explaining this is that it goes back to that training montage scene where you had that 1 month break and you see Yuji training with Kusakabe, and it looked like they were doing some type of soul swap. Well, that's because Oui Oui was the one who swapped the two bodies. And so basically that's how Yuji learned simple domain, because it goes back to what Kusakabe said about Yuji, which is it's muscle memory. Kusekabe gets into Yuji's body. He uses simple domain a bunch of times, and Yuji's body has the muscle memory to use it. This brings us back to the main battle where Yuji uses simple domain in a response to Sukuna's domain expansion, but there is a catch to it. So Sukuna, he can't maintain his domain expansion for too long. It's only going to be for less than 2 minutes, which that might not seem like a lot, but against someone like Sukuna, that is a lifetime, which is why everyone is saying to themselves they just need to wait it out. But even Yuji, the main character, the guy with main character plot armor, eventually his simple domain explodes and he loses his leg, and this is where Sukuna busts out a move that we have been waiting for and we have not seen since the Shibuya instant arc. And that boy Yuji, he better be ready to stand proud, because one leg or no legs, he appears to be getting the Jogo and Maharaga treatment, because Sukuna is preparing that flame arrow that we saw him use on Jogo and Maharaga. We didn't even see him use it against Gojo, so you almost want to say Gojo stocks are crashing and Itadori stocks are rising, because this is a backhanded compliment to Itadori.